parish brew days and the village tithe ale settled deeper into your pillow, letting the modern world slip away until only the faint creak of a medieval timber frame remains. It is the spring of 1377, a year of two kings in England and of one very ordinary brew day in the parish of Little St. Osyth. You arrive before dawn, when the oak-leafed dark sky still holds the smell of damp earth and last night's hearth smoke. The barley fields that neighbor the village are only ankle-high, soft and bluish in the uncertain light, but the grain for today's ale has long since been harvested, malted, and stored in linen sacks against the buttery scent of mice. The parish is raising money for roof repairs, so today's batch is no private tipple. It is the tithe ale, a community brew whose profits will patch holes between saints on the nave ceiling. The idea is simple. The church supplies malt, firewood, and water rights. The villagers lend labor, and everyone drinks for a modest fee that is difficult to refuse when your soul might depend on it. Compared with the grand feasts of lords, the tithe ale is humble, but here, humility is a reliable path to getting pleasantly wasted while insisting it is all for a higher purpose. You picture the alewife in charge, Mistress Agnes Mercer, whose round wool cap always lists to starboard, and whose knowledge of yeast would shame a friar. Brewing is her craft, and on tithe days she becomes a conductor of quiet orchestration. Before sparrows have begun their argument in the eaves, she has stoked the brick hearth beneath a copper brew kettle wide as a baptismal font. The firewood crackles with resin, and sparks briefly outline the low rafters in orange stars that die before they set fire to anything but your imagination. Agnes's first task is to fetch water. In this century, that means dragging an oaken bucket past hens, past the one-eyed village cat, and down to the communal well, where carved stone edges have been polished slick by centuries of calloused hands. The water emerges cold enough to sting the wrists and sweet enough to day. At least a brew without needing the pinch of fennel seeds that sometimes disguises swampy notes. She does not linger. Water, once raised, must be used quickly, lest the guardian toad that locals swear lives at the bottom send up bad airs that turn malt sour back in the brewhouse. The malt waits on a wooden mesh. The grains are husky, having been kilned over straw smoke for 3 hours. Yesterday a detail that will lend the finished ale an almost grassy boredom of flavor, the kind that makes it easy to drink for jugs before noticing the sweet heaviness. In your limbs, Agnes stirs the crushed malt into the hot water, creating the mash. A porridge whose surface she judges by color. It should look, she says, as brown as a sparrow's back, but lighter than a monk's robe. All of this she measures by eye and wrist, never by scale. A reminder that medieval precision lives in the body rather than in instruments. You peer over her shoulder, though she does not see you. The vapors that rise from the mash smell faintly, of warm bread, fresh hay, and wet burlap comforting, unhurried aromas that hint at the day's small chaos to come. In the corner, 2 parish boys, both no taller than Agnes's elbow, split kindling for the next stage, arguing in whispers about how many leftover drams the vicar will permit them once night arrives. Their wooden mallets thud in slow rhythm, like a heartbeat steady enough to lull even the restless. While the grains steep, 3 Hail Marys and Psalm 51 in length, Agnes consults the parish ledger, hanging from a nail beside the doorway. Tiny crabbed letters tally last month's brew. 32 gallons sold. 1 gallon offered to travelers for free. 2 gallons lost to spillage, which everyone knows is code for the vicar's private cup. Today she hopes for 40 gallons. The roof has leaked since Candlemas, and choir boys complain of rainwater falling with perfect inconvenience onto the psalm books during practice. When the mash has rested, Agnes pulls the wooden plug from the mash tun's base. The liquid that trickles out is the wort, sweet and lazily amber in the light of 2 sputtering tallow candles. She collects it in a shallow copper pan, then scoops in a bundle of yarrow and bog myrtle tied with flax twine. Hops, that newfangled continental weed, are almost unknown in Little St. Osyth, and some villagers mutter that bitter herbs will upset the bile. Yet the yarrow will lend a gentle dryness that keeps the drink from being cloying. Besides, bog myrtle's reputed ability to encourage dreamlike intoxication is a perfectly acceptable byproduct on fundraising day. As the wort reaches a timid boil, the ale conner arrives, Master John Cole, whose job is to test brew quality before sale. You watch him press a circle of woolen breeches against the earthen floor, then pour a spoonful of yesterday's ale onto it. If his trousers stick when he tries to stand, the drink is judged too sugary and liable to spoil. If not, it passes. Today his breeches rise cleanly. He pronounces the parish supplies serviceable, a word so unexciting that you feel sleep pulling at the edges of your awareness. Even his shoes, patched with lambskin at the toes, seem bored of their own souls, but there is still yeast to add. In a wooden jar resting on a windowsill is the balm skimmed from last week's batch and coddled like an heirloom. Agnes tips the frothy mass into the cooled wort as you might tuck a child into bed, murmuring a rhyme half prayer, half receipt about St. Arnold of Soissons, patron of brewers. Almost at once, tiny bubbles gather on the surface, promising tomorrow's mild enchantment. The jar is rinsed, inverted, and left to dry, its clay lip shining like a crescent moon in the dim room. Outside, you hear the blacksmith's hammer begin its day-long punctuation, the church bell mark terse, and the distant bay of sheep herded toward marsh pasture. Little St. Osyth wakes slowly, but the brewhouse is already the village's warm heart, pulsing steady fumes of barley and steam. Children will soon arrive with pitchers, women with earthen jugs, men with wooden tankards marked by knife scratched. Initials, payment is rarely coin. More often it is a promise of labor, a spindle of wool, or a hen to be delivered after she survives the next fox raid. Commerce flows gentle as wort through Astrainer. Yet, beneath the serenity, a quiet tension knits everything together. Will today's ale ferment true? Will the roof finally cease its leaking? Will the ale conner's sticky breeches test hold up under scrutiny if the sheriff stops by? These questions are small, but in 1377 they are enough to clutch the throat almost as tightly as a plague rumor. At midday the first pails of fresh, alenaged, milky, and only shyly alcoholic are ladled out for the labourers who have spent the morning mending hedges. They drink from the rim with the practised tilt of those who know that dregs settle quickly. A few coughs at the herbal sharpness, though no one complains outright. After all, complaining would imply offering an alternative, and brewing alternatives require effort. Far easier to accept the sip of strangeness, swallow, and wipe a sleeve across the lips in mute approval. You note the gestures of comradeship that follow, a shared hunk of rye bread, a joke about the Reeves' new cot being dyed the colour of goose droppings, a quick tracing of the cross by a widow who worries that laughter on a church day invites misfortune. These moments slide by with the unobtrusive clarity of water under a mill never quite stopping, never quite demanding attention, yet powering the village in silent revolutions. By late afternoon, the ale has entered its most vulnerable stage. The yeast multiplies furiously, exhaling whispers of carbonic sighs. Agnes stirs twice more with a paddle carved from ash, each time watching the surface for the tiny floating rings that signal healthy fermentation. She will sleep lightly tonight, ear-tuned for any shift in the bubbling note. A brewer's vigil is as real as a shepherd's, though the flock lives in a barrel. The sun begins its unhurried descent. Slanting light pokes through cracks in the wattle and daub walls, laying gold stripes across the cooling copper kettle. Someone starts a psalm outside, perhaps rehearsal for Sunday, but the voices wander off key and then fall silent, replaced by the clack of dice from a doorway farther down the lane. Gambling on tithe ale night is technically discouraged, but the vicar reasons sometimes aloud that a little wagering encourages more rounds, and more rounds encourage a sounder. Roof, as you drift at the edge of this scene, the day's colours fade to the soft greys of candlelit dusk. Agnes lifts a small ladle of still fermenting ale, holds it to her lips, and sips. She considers, nods, then adds a skeptical pinch of crushed coriander, personal quirk whose origins she never explains. The spice will rest overnight, marrying to the malt, and by morning the drink will be ready for its first honest test, the sale at the church porch. Parishioners will queue politely, drop pennies or promises into a wooden box, and carry home the very thing that will soften the hard straw of their mattresses and coax them into gentle sleep. Much as you now feel yourself coaxed, yet a final question lingers above the settling foam, unanswered and faintly exciting. When dawn returns and the ale is tasted in public, will the careful balance of malt, yarrow, and coriander meet the villager's unruly palate? Or will the roof of St. Osyth compete for funds with a brew nun? Will by twice. The rooster's second crow threads through the thatch above and stirs the stillness of little St. Osyth, the village, still washed in mist and yesterday's sleep, begins to stretch itself awake. But the brew house has already been breathing since before the horizon took on colour. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of warm grain and soft yeast, the kind of heavy, living smell that clings to the beams and seems to press against the skin like wool soaked in rain. Agnes Mercer is there before anyone else, standing before her tun like a sentry, one hand resting on the side of the warm barrel. Her other hand lifts the lid. A sigh of fermenting gas escapes. The ale is alive. The yeast has done its job through the night. Small bubbles hiss and burst at the surface, sluggish but regular, a sure sign that the brew has reached the right stage. The fermentation is not violent, no need to lash the lid down with leather straps this time. Still, Agnes narrows her eyes, as if mistrustful of perfection. The brewhouse begins to fill, slowly and predictably, with the small cast of villagers who always seem to appear just when needed. Walter, the Reeve's wife, enters first, broom in hand, muttering to herself about boys and the footprints they've left in the ash. Then the two sisters, Edith and Ellen, wide-eyed and quick to move, but never entirely clear on what needs doing. They settle into their morning roles with the familiarity of muscle memory. The fire is stoked, the cups are washed in steaming water, and a low wooden board is dragged to the doorway to serve as a counter. The church bell tolls prime, and the first footsteps begin to crunch the gravel outside. By the time the sun crests the treetops, there's already a line. The first in it is a ploughman with a leather strap tied tight around one knee. Behind him, the midwife from last week's stillbirth, then the shepherd boys, whose qualifications for drinking ale are questionable but who have brought with them jugs twice their size. Every vessel has its own story. Some are carved, some are cracked and patched with pitch. One old flask bears a pilgrim's badge from a shrine no one's quite sure exists anymore. Regardless of shape or history, each container receives the same treatment: 2 ladles of ale from the tun, poured with slow care by Agnes, and the whispered phrase, "for the roof." It is both a blessing and a reminder. Coins are exchanged, where they exist, though fewer than Agnes would like. Most payments are promises. The midwife offers beeswax, soft and golden as butter. The ploughman offers 3 hours' labor on the nave scaffolding. A girl barely tall enough to see the rim of the tun offers to plucked hens, to be delivered when caught. It's not ideal, but it is expected. Few things in a village like this are bought with money. What matters is that the ledger reflects value, not coin. Agnes writes every promise down, her ink a little watery from the morning dew. Master John Cole arrives not long after the first jug is handed out. He carries himself with the solemnity of a man who has pronounced too many verdicts on too much subpar ale. This morning, he performs his duties with ceremony. He dips his tasting rod, holds it to his lips, and lets the liquid sit there. There's a silence that stretches a little too long. When he finally swallows, he gives only a single nod and says, "Sound." It is the same word he always uses, but today it's accompanied by a breath through the nose that almost counts as a smile. The line shifts slightly, everyone a bit looser now, reassured that their jugs will not be filled with something that will make them vomit in the ditch or fail to warm their bellies before sleep. As more villagers gather, the yard outside the brewhouse starts to take on the gentle hum of an event. Someone has brought a drum, little more than a stretched hide nailed to a wooden hoop. It sounds like dull thunder when struck, but no one minds. A few of the younger men start rolling dice on the overturned base of a cart, and laughter slips between them like mist through willow branches. Agnes keeps one eye on the brew and one eye on the people. She notices when a lad tries to slip through the queue with a chipped jug and no coin. She sees the older woman who drinks before paying and then, fumbling, forgets what she meant to offer. These are common enough occurrences. She says nothing but marks each one in her mind. Not to punish, but to remember. Every now and then, someone raises the matter of the roof. A tile has slipped. The last rain soaked the hymeneal. One man says he found moss growing on the north beam. Another swears he saw a star through the ceiling last Tuesday. They speak as though the building were a sick relative, always a little worse, but never bad enough to bury. The ale, meanwhile, continues to pour. Just after midday, a rider approaches. From the south road, the horse is lean and foam-flecked. The man on its back is Sir Thomas de Mandeville, a lesser noble and steward to the sheriff. His cloak is rich with dust, and his expression more withered than his age. He dismounts slowly, not with ceremony, but with the deliberation of a man who expects every greeting to be double-edged. When he steps into the brewhouse yard, the music falters and the dice fall still. Sir Thomas does not ask for ale, he expects it. Agnes fills his jack herself, using the cleanest ladle. He drinks with a flat expression, eyes on her the whole time. When finished, he announces that he will see the ledger. Cole produces it and holds it open. Sir Thomas reads slowly, tracing each line with a gloved finger. He asks about tax. He asks about permissions. He does not accuse, but neither does he. Bless. When he finally closes the book and returns it, he mutters, "Let it be noted," and nothing more. It is, in its way, a victory, as the afternoon wears on. The brew begins to run lower, and the villagers begin to sway more than they step. Children dart between legs, sometimes tripping over stray stones or goats. Agnes stops serving an hour. Before dusk, it is safer that way. The line breaks apart with good humor, and people wander homeward with jugs held protectively against their chests. Inside the brewhouse, the tally begins. Walter's wife counts coins. The girls mark the promises of labor with chalk lines on a slate. Agnes takes the measure of the casks and notes how much is left. Then she opens the wooden lockbox. The coins inside shine like a harvest of dull stars. She tips them into her palm and begins to count. When the final coin is placed in the pile, she does not smile. The sum is decent, respectable, but not as high as she hoped. Something about it feels thin. She reviews the ledger, checks for mistakes, but the numbers are correct. Her brow furrows, and she wonders, not for the first time, whether generosity is shrinking in the village, or if perhaps the ale this year lacked something unmeasurable. Maybe it's the cost of the coriander, or maybe it's the shadow of the night's visit. The feeling gnaws at her dot. Outside, the air has cooled. The last embers in the hearth are dimming, and the brewhouse begins to smell more like damp wood than beer. The candle beside her trembles as the breeze from the door brushes past it. She closes the ledger gently, rests her hands on the wood, and stares at the flame until it settles. Her voice is soft, almost a whisper. Will it be enough? She is not asking anyone, yet the question hangs in the air with a weight that is hard to shake. The brewhouse is quiet now. The ale rests in the tun, and Agnes leans back in her chair, listening to the faint, patient sound of yeast still at work in the dark. And you are left wondering too. In the silence, will one more day of sales bring enough coin to seal the church roof, or will it simply delay the next leak and the next round of worry? The morning after the tithe sale breaks over Little St. Osyth, not with drama, but with a kind of weary continuity. A soft breeze moves through the hedges, carrying the faint scent of wet wool and mashed grain. The village doesn't wake with celebration or song, but rather with the quiet motions of people who have shared something together, drunk from the same barrels, stood in the same queue, returned home with the same gentle warmth in their bellies, and now rise to face another day that is no more special than the last. In many ways, this is the essence of a medieval year. The rhythm of tasks repeated, of hopes diluted, of effort poured into things that if done right no one will remember. In the brewhouse, the morning is sluggish. The fire in the hearth is down to a few glowing coals. Agnes Mercer moves slowly, not because she's tired, but because there is nothing urgent left to do. The casks are mostly drained. The tun that once gurgled with fermenting promise now lies silent, its surface scummed with the faint traces of ale foam that cling like memories of livelier hours. She pours a little water over the rim and lets it sit while she sharpens a knife on a whetstone, more out of habit than need. The knife is for cutting lengths of linen to tie around the remaining jugs, a sign that they've been properly measured and sealed for later sale, but truthfully, few people care for such formality anymore. Outside, the church bell chimes, not with any special urgency, but to remind everyone that time continues, whether the roof leaks or not. The vicar appears soon. After arriving at the brewhouse door in his patched robes with the shy half-smile of a man trying not to seem overly invested, he has come to collect the tally. Agnes already has it. Ready coins counted, notes tallied, goods recorded. She hands him the ledger with the gravity of someone who knows this isn't a gift, but a report card. He reads it silently, nodding once or twice, lips pursed. She watches him closely, but says nothing. Well, he murmurs at last, it's something. Not all, but something. Agnes doesn't respond. It's the sort of sentence that closes itself. What could she say? The villagers came, they drank, they paid what they could. Perhaps it was a poor harvest year for generosity. Perhaps some of the men gave their spare coin to the tavern on the outskirts instead, where the ale is stronger, even if less blessed. Or maybe the problem is simpler this. Tithel, though well made, lacked the excitement of years past. No fiddler, no mischief, no accident of drunken poetry gone village legend, just good, steady brewing, poured out in humble service, and good. Steady brewing rarely turns a profit large enough to patch an ancient roof. The vicar thanks her and tucks the ledger beneath his robe like a fragile egg. He does not mention Sir Thomas, though both of them must be thinking of him. Steward's visit casts a long shadow, and even longer when it comes without warning. The vicar departs, leaving Agnes alone again with the morning stillness. The faint yeasty scent in the walls, and a stack of promises that may or may not be fulfilled before winter sets in by midday. A few villagers trickle back with half-hopeful questions. Is there any ale left? Could they perhaps have another measure for supper, or trade a bolt of homespun wool for what remains? Agnes obliges where she can, but only carefully. The final jugs must last until next week's reckoning. Sale today means one less argument in the vestry tomorrow. She accepts a few trades eggs, kindling, even an old wool cloak. Still good in the sleeves, but refuses others with an apologetic shake of the head. It is not personal. Nothing in a Tithel ever is, even when it feels like it. One woman, Maud, the washer, lingers longer than the others. Her eyes are rimmed red, whether from drink or grief, it's hard to say. She says her youngest boy cried for hours last night, convinced the thunder was angels stomping across the roof because he spilled a cup of ale. She laughs when she says it, but the sound is brittle, like ice underfoot. Agnes pours her a small cup unmeasured off the record and says nothing while Maud drinks. Some debts aren't worth writing down. The afternoon brings clouds, not dark ones, just the ordinary kind that drift in from the coast and thicken the air with a kind of cool blankness. Agnes climbs the ladder to the church roof with the mason and Walter the reeve to assess the damage once more. They don't say much. The holes are still there. The missing tiles still missing. The rot in the western beam a little worse than last time. The money from the Tithel will cover repairs, but only the most pressing ones. The mason rubs his chin, mutters about a year or two, maybe 3, before the whole nave needs shoring up again. Agnes squints at the sky. She thinks, it'll hold through the autumn, probably, if the wind doesn't shift too sharply. If the snow comes late, she returns to the brewhouse as evening approaches, sleeves dusted with roof grit, hair flattened from her cap. The place is quiet again. The girls are gone. The embers are out. Only one jug remains unclaimed on the table. A smaller one than most, with a carved oak stopper and a ribbon tied around the handle. It belongs to the widower from the East End, who paid in advance and promised to return. He hasn't yet. Agnes turns the jug in her hands, then sets it aside, careful not to disturb the ribbon as she sits by the window. Candlelight creeping slowly into the room, the sounds of the village soften. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks. A child sings to herself, off-key and too fast. The distant clang of metal suggests the smith is still working, but half-heartedly. There is no festival feeling, no lingering glow from yesterday's drink, just the quiet, heavy calm of a village returned to itself. Agnes opens the ledger once more. She runs her finger down the list of names, tokens, coins, favors, and odd promises to geese. A plough, a measure of oats, a vow to repair the vicar's fence. They stretch out across the pages like a map of hope stitched from obligations. Each entry is boring in its own way. There are no great dramas, no heresies, no crimes. Just people giving what they could, offering what they had, believing, perhaps, that it was enough. She closes the book and looks around the room. The ale is almost gone. The church roof still leaks. The villagers have done their part, mostly. The story is not complete, but in this world, stories rarely are. The ale will run dry. The ledger will be copied and filed away. The roof will hold for now. And next year, it will all happen again. Maybe with more coins. Maybe with fewer. But before she leaves, Agnes does something she hasn't done in years. She pours herself the last ladle of ale, just one. Not for the roof, not for the parish, for herself. She sips it slowly, watching the light through the window curl against the foam. The ale is softer now, mellowed by time, still carrying the ghost of coriander, the whisper of yarrow, the warmth of barley. It is not remarkable, not even particularly strong, but it is hers, and for one quiet moment, it is enough. She finishes the cup, sets it down, and rises from her chair. Outside, the night is settling gently over little St. Osyth. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls. The brewhouse door creaks as it closes behind her on in time. The jug with the ribbon will be claimed. The roof will be patched. The ledger will be stored, then forgotten. And no one will remember the taste of this year's tithe. But perhaps, when the wind blows through the nave in winter and doesn't find its way through a crack in the beam, someone will look up and say, "Funny how we managed it that year." And someone else will reply, "I must have been a good brew." Ancient love spells and potions in the fading glow of a Roman oil lamp, its flame shivering with the breath of distant footsteps. A woman in a small villa near Ephesus grinds dried roots into a paste with more focus than emotion. Her hands are steady, practiced, but the room smells of desperation, clay, vinegar, and the faint metallic temps of dried rose petals crushed long past their prime. The love potion she prepares tonight isn't unusual. What makes it remarkable is how ordinary it is. Across the ancient world, love like illness, hunger, or war was a force understood not through poetry but through potions, charms, and whispered rituals. It is tempting to imagine these practices as theatrical or exotic, but in truth, they were part of the daily grind of domestic survival. Love, or more often lust mistaken for it, was dangerous. It disrupted households, caused fights, and left behind children without names in ledgers. To ward against these risks, or bend them to one's will, people turned not to Cupid, but to recipes copied from older hands, passed through generations in hushed voices, or scratched into lead tablets buried beneath thresholds. In the woman's mortar tonight, powdered vetch, scraped from the roots, gathered under the full moon. Dried bulls, bile pungent, sticky, and a few curls of her own hair, which she cuts from behind her ear, where it won't be missed. She adds a drop of oil from the temple, stolen or gifted, no one will ask. The potion is destined not for her lips, but for the wine cup of a man who has smiled at her twice but lingered at another stall in the market. She doesn't wish him harm, she only wishes him nearer. The formula she uses dates back over 100 years, copied from the works of Apollonius of Tyana, though she has never heard the name. The spell promises that the man will feel a warming beneath the tongue when he next sees her, and will walk no road that leads away. Such recipes were common across the Greek and Roman worlds. Some were inscribed on papyrus scrolls with neat hands and scholarly titles, often mixing the language of medicine with that of magic. Others were scrawled roughly on clay or metal. One surviving cursed tablet from Athens, dated to the 4th century BCE, simply reads, "Burn his insides, make him restless, bind him to me alone." It was folded 7 times and nailed shut before being buried in a grave. Love was rarely patient. Love magic wasn't limited to women, though historians often fixate on them as the primary practitioners. Men, too, sought help in matters of the heart, more accurately, matters of flesh. One spell from Roman Egypt advises the petitioner to burn a chameleon and mix its ashes into the wine of the beloved. Another calls for the heart of a black dog and a mirror facing the new moon, combined in a ritual designed to make the object of desire dream only of the caster. These spells blurred the line between enchantment and coercion, not unlike the relationships they aimed to control. Behind every spell was an assumption that love could be manipulated like weather or trade winds. The ingredients were rarely symbolic. They were tactile, practical, pungent. Honey, often thought of as sweet and harmless, was used to seal affection, especially when poured into shoes and left overnight on an altar. Menstrual blood, considered potent, was sometimes hidden in food to bind the recipient in fidelity. The use of bodily fluid, saliva, sweat, even nail clippings, was widespread, not out of perversion, but because the ancients believed that essence lived in the smallest pieces of the body. To consume such things unknowingly was to take in part of someone's soul. Recipes varied not only by region but by status. In rural Gaul, a love spell might be whispered into a barley cake and fed to a neighbor during festival games. In Alexandria, a well-off merchant might hire a professional magician, often a woman, to conduct a full-scale rite involving wax effigies, incense, and invocations to deities, both Greek and Egyptian. The effect was the same: to stir desire, compel attention, bind affection, or, in some cases, cause torment if rejected. Not all love spells were hopeful. Many were bitter. Some sought to punish a lover who strayed, to cause impotence, or to ruin the marriage of a rival. A spell uncovered in a grave in Thessalonica commands the gods of the underworld to sever the bed of Myrtle and Leontes as one tears cloth. The tablet bears marks of someone biting it before burial, possibly as part of the ritual, or perhaps out of sheer frustration. Spells were meant to be complete, physical things, words, not just said, but etched, folded, buried, swallowed, burnt, or tied around birds' necks and released into the sky. Despite the drama of the ingredients and language, the practice of love magic was deeply mundane. It often occurred in kitchens, garden corners, or near hearths. It involved measuring, stirring, waiting. There was no guarantee of success. Spells frequently included disclaimers: if it pleased the gods, or should the stars allow. Most users would never know whether their potion had worked, or whether the object of their desire had simply felt lonely that night. This ambiguity was part of the charm, both figuratively and literally. The Romans, ever bureaucratic, tried at various times to control or criminalize such practices. Love potions, especially those involving poison or bodily fluids, were occasionally prosecuted under the category of beneficium, a broad legal term encompassing both magical and chemical harm. Yet prosecutions were rare, and love magic continued quietly, out of sight of the magistrates. It was too woven into the daily fabric of life to root out completely. In Jewish communities of late antiquity, love charms were adapted to monotheistic structures. Texts, known as Sefer Harazim, included lists of angelic names and prayers intended to attract affection or favor. One amulet from Syria, now in a museum collection, bears a Hebrew inscription asking for the door of the heart to be opened of a named man, along with symbols likely borrowed from local magical traditions. Christian communities also wrestled with love magic, often condemning it from pulpits while quietly employing versions of it themselves. A charm invoking Saint Cyprian survives from 6th century Spain, though its wording is nearly identical to earlier pagan incantations, just with the deities renamed. The woman in Ephesus places her finished potion into a small clay jug, plugs it with wax, and buries it beneath the threshold of her intended's home. This part of the spell is essential. He must walk over it without knowing. The crossing is what binds the charm. Whether he will love her or simply be confused, tomorrow is irrelevant. The spell has been cast. The rest belongs to the gods or perhaps just to the rhythms of human nature. What is striking, more than anything else, is the ordinariness of it all. We like to imagine love spells as exotic and theatrical robes, chants, midnight rituals. But for the people of the ancient world, love magic was closer to cooking than ceremony. Ingredients were gathered, combined, applied. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but always there was the belief that something could be done, that love was not fate, but craft. As you sit quietly now, imagining her footsteps fading down the alleyway, her clay-stained hands brushing against her skirts, you may wonder, did he ever feel that warming beneath the tongue? Did he pause, unknowingly, above the buried jug? Or was the spell simply another lonely gesture, absorbed by the earth and forgotten by the living? And what might we still carry today from those long-vanished kitchens, those whispered prayers, those petals and ashes and salted threads? By the early Middle Ages, the tone of love magic had begun to shift. In the dim stone cottages of Anglo-Saxon England or the vine-draped villas of post-Roman Gaul, the old Greco-Roman formulas still lingered, but they were being repackaged in the language of saints, sin, and sacrament. Love, once treated as a bodily phenomenon to be conjured or dissolved through herbs and effigies, now came increasingly under the jurisdiction of the Church. But that didn't mean the spells stopped. Instead, they changed their shape. In a village near Tours in the 9th century, a widow named Alice kneels before a worn wooden chest. The sun hasn't yet climbed past the orchard trees, and she is alone. She unwraps a bundle of linen, inside of which lies a small circle of wax brownish, slightly melted, and roughly shaped like a man. Its arms are short, its head uncarved, but the chest bears the scratched letters, J-A-N. This is not art. Its intention made solid. Alice whispers a few words in Latin, not liturgical Latin, but the Latin of peasant prayer books, mangled and reassembled. Her mother taught her the phrases, and her mother learned them from an old woman with a crooked spine and a talent for curing sheep. The wax figure has already been baptized with water from the church font, though Alice technically only dipped a finger in during Mass and flicked it into the cloth when no one looked. She ties a scrap of her apron round the figure's middle and presses it gently between her palms. The ritual is simple. Name the man, tie him to you, warm the figure near the hearth. As this wax softens, so shall his heart, she whispers. As the fire warms him, so shall he come to me. The ritual doesn't promise happiness or even affection, just attention. And in a small village, attention is everything. There is no grand conclusion to the rite. When the figure grows soft, she places it back in the linen and tucks it inside the chest, beside a string of dried apples and a piece of parchment inscribed with Psalm 91. That, too, was part of the spell. A little holiness to cover the superstition. The line between sacred and profane was always thin in these centuries. One saint's relic could be another woman's charm. Church authorities, especially in the Carolingian and early Capetian periods, were deeply concerned about such blurred lines. Bishops issued letters condemning superstitious women who bind hearts with roots and mutterings. Manuals for priests began including questions for confession, such as, "Hast thou made an image to summon love? Hast thou sought herbs in silence beneath the full moon?" But the punishments were rarely severe. Most often, the penance was a few days of fasting or extra prayers recited barefoot. Even the clergy understood that loneliness was a persistent affliction, one not easily remedied by doctrine alone. The ingredients, too, had shifted. Rue, once valued by the Romans, was now considered a protective herb, capable of warding off lust or redirecting it. Basil was said to inspire affection when placed under a pillow. The use of menstrual blood continued, though increasingly condemned as unclean. One Anglo-Saxon medical text warns, "Do not eat the bread of a woman who bleeds, lest your heart be turned to her against your will." Whether this was genuine advice or retrospective moralizing is unclear, but the fear was real. In the courts of the aristocracy, love magic grew more elaborate and, paradoxically, more hidden. Nobles were supposed to marry for property and bloodlines, not desire. But desire still crept in through the side doors of banquets and spring festivals. In the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose patronage of troubadours helped define courtly love, whispered rumors spoke of charms sewn into hymns and poems infused with coded spells. One tale describes a silk ribbon soaked in rose water and wine, worn beneath the sleeve for 7 nights, then gifted to a beloved who, upon wearing it, would dream no dream but thee. Whether such a charm worked was beside the point. It provided the illusion of agency in a world where most affections were arranged, not chosen. In rural monasteries, love spells took on stranger forms. A monk in 11th century Germany recorded, with equal parts revulsion and fascination, a village remedy involving a goose feather dipped in the blood of a black rooster. The woman was to write the name of her love 3 times on her wrist with it, then wash it off in water drawn before dawn. The water was then sprinkled in the path of the man, who would be unable to think of anyone else. I know not if this is true, the monk adds, but I write it down, that I may know how deeply sin has taken root among the laity. What's striking in these medieval examples is how love magic always seems to teeter on the edge of being embarrassing. No one boasts about making a charm. These are not proud public rituals. They are private, sometimes pathetic acts, fumblings in the dark, both literal and spiritual. A woman makes a figure. A man leaves bread near a girl's doorstep with a silver thread hidden inside. A childless wife smears a tincture of honey and ash on her husband's belt, hoping to restore his passion. There is always the hope that no one finds out, that if the spell fails, it fails in silence. And often it did. There are countless stories, preserved in letters and sermons, of potions that backfired. One Frankish woman, seeking to bind a knight's affection, accidentally gave the potion to his squire, who became dangerously obsessed with her instead. Another woman, accused of bewitching a man into marriage, was later discovered to have simply fed him heavily spiced wine until he grew pliant. In one unusually well-preserved court case from 1279, a woman in Norwich was fined for unholy mixture, which turned out to be a failed recipe involving goat, fat, onion, and cloves intended to make her husband less fond of his mistress. All it made him was ill. Still, people kept trying. By the 13th century, commercial charm sellers had emerged in larger towns. In Paris, a woman named Jezebel was arrested for selling women's herbs, including known aphrodisiacs like mandrake, sage, and fennel soaked in red wine. She claimed they were for cooking. The court was unconvinced but issued no harsh punishment. It was difficult to draw a line between herb woman and witch, and to many wives, it seemed, were loyal customers, and not all spells were made in pursuit of romantic union. Some were crafted to end desire. Monastic texts sometimes describe potions intended to cool the body's fires. These often involved bitter herbs, wormwood, thistle, or vinegar steeped with ashes from a burned wedding veil. Widows might drink such mixtures as a kind of ritual farewell to longing. Some nuns used symbolic acts, like burying a doll filled with rosemary and mint, representing the burial of worldly love. These weren't just gestures of piety, they were therapeutic, a way of telling the heart, enough, there's something deeply human about the persistence of these small magics. Not because they were effective, but because they gave people the feeling that love could be approached with tools, that loneliness, jealousy, and unrequited passion were not just things to suffer, but things to tinker with, like bad crops or sore joints. You could try something, mix something, speak a name in the right direction, press a ribbon into someone's palm. At worst, you'd be embarrassed. At best, you'd be loved, and the world, for just a moment, might feel slightly more manageable. As twilight falls on Alice Village, near Tours, she passes Jan on the road. He nods, politely. He doesn't linger. He does not turn his head to look again. But then, perhaps an hour later, he arrives at her door, asking about some borrowed cloth. They speak for a while. She invites him in. Nothing happens, not yet. But the wax figure remains warm inside the chest, and Alice lights a new candle just in case. Did the spell work? Or did Jan simply find himself bored that evening, curious to see what she'd say? A century later, in a narrow street in Bologna, a woman named Chiara leans over a wooden table lined with glass bottles and bundles of herbs hung from the rafters. It is the spring of 1372. Outside, the bells of San Petronio ring for vespers. Inside, the air is warm with the mingled scents of marjoram, vinegar, beeswax, and something faintly sulphurous from the alley beyond. The light from her oil lamp flickers. Across the wax seal of a jar labeled Amor vincet omnia. Love conquers all. The irony doesn't escape her. Chiara is not a witch, not officially. She would describe herself as a herbal consult. But people come to her with aching hearts as often as with swollen joints. She doesn't promise miracles. She offers things that might help. A sachet of lavender to slip beneath a pillow, a cordial made with thyme and brandy, or a coin-sized charm etched with Venus's symbol to wear between the breast. Sometimes she adds a few Latin words, more for comfort than power. Tonight, she prepares something more deliberate. A wealthy merchant's daughter, quiet, anxious, always pulling at her sleeve, has asked for a potion to make a particular young man look at her as if she were light itself. It's not love she wants. It's not even lust. It's attention. Chiara knows the feeling too well. She takes a bottle from the shelf, rose water steeped with orange peel and just enough valerian root to calm trembling hands. Into it, she drops 3 cloves and a small scrap of silk cut from the girl's own sleeve, tied in a knot. She doesn't add blood. That's not her kind of work. But she does slip in a whisper, said with eyes closed. A habit learned long ago in Ferrara from a nun who said she'd once loved someone so deeply it made her teeth ache. The potion is harmless. Probably it might make the girl feel bold. It might smell good enough to make the boy lean in closer. That could be enough. It's often enough in the medieval world. As the church's influence grew and urban centers developed, love spells began to walk a tighter rope. They were still practiced in secret, in kitchens, in back rooms, but the stakes were higher. The Inquisition had taken root. Confessions of maleficia or harmful magic could lead to punishment. The line between a healing charm and a heretical act grew thinner with each generation, yet people continued. Love, in all its mess and promise, refused to obey law or liturgy. We see traces of this in the trial records that survive, ulloing pages from inquisitorial scribes who wrote with equal parts irritation and fascination. One case from 15th century Aragon tells of a young man who buried a dead lizard wrapped in red thread beneath a woman's doorstep to stir her belly with thoughts of him. When she grew sick not with love, but with fever, he was accused of sorcery. He confessed, not because he believed he had harmed her, but because he feared what they might do if he denied it. The belief that love could be compelled through material means ran deep. In Spain, bundles called ligaduras, literally bindings, were placed under mattresses, meant to keep a husband faithful or a wife affectionate. In Poland, it was said that placing 7 poppy seeds in a man's shoe would make him dream of the one who placed them. In Germany, girls whispered names into apple cores and threw them into the river, watching to see which way the current pulled. In Scotland, lovers carved their initials on rowan wood, then burned it under the moon to seal their bond. Even when magic faded from the conversation, rituals remained. In Renaissance Venice, women wrote love letters in rosewater, invisible until warmed over flame. In Paris, apothecaries sold perfumes that stirred the senses, promising attraction through scent alone. Were these spells? Not exactly, but they were built on the same premise, that love could be coaxed, nudged, maybe even bent if not fully controlled. Not all of these practices were hopeful. Many carried a kind of bitter edge. A woman might mix mustard seed with hair and bury it in her rival's garden to sow discord. A man might commission a charm to cause withering of desire in a former lover. Some remedies were little more than poisons, disguised as passions. The line between love potion and fatal draught was, at times, dangerously porous. A tale survives from Florence, told by the chronicler Matteo Villani, of a woman who gave her husband a potion to reignite his love. She had bought it from a traveling friar who promised it would renew their wedding night. The husband died within hours. The potion, they discovered, was made of belladonna and wormwood in strong wine. She was arrested, tried, and condemned not for murder, but for forbidden arts. The friar was never found. Still, many of these stories are exceptions, not rules. Most love spells were small, private acts of yearning, not vengeance. They were a way of holding Unov, saying, I matter, I am here. See me. Chiara, in her shop in Bologna, does not believe herself dangerous. She believes herself useful. Women come to her when they are tired of waiting. Men come when they cannot speak plainly. Once, a priest's servant came with a broken locket and a tear-stained note, asking if the charm inside could be revived. Chiara said no, but she offered tea. Sometimes tea is enough. Outside, the city settles into night. Candles bloom in windows. Footsteps slow. From a nearby alley, muffled strains of a lute drift upward. Chiara's client returns, pale and expectant. She takes the bottle, clutches it like it's glass spun from hope. She doesn't ask for guarantees. She only asks what time to give it. Chiara tells her, sunset. Things begun at dusk carry the blessing of in-between. After the girl leaves, Chiara sits alone. She stares at her shelves, each bottle labeled in a tidy handsalito. Sogno, desiderio, silenzio, relief, dream, desire, silence, spells in all but name. She thinks of her own youth, the boy with the crooked nose who gave her violets. The letter she burned before she ever wrote it. She picks up a tiny jar, opens it, and inhales the scent myrrh. Rose and a touch of bitter almond. It's not for sale, it's for memory. By the time the stars are out, her shutters are closed and the street is quiet. She extinguishes the lamp. The room smells faintly of time and regret. And still, somewhere in the city, a girl slips a drop of something into a cup and waits. There's a question that lingers across centuries, harder than any spell, quieter than any incantation. Did it work? Did the boy look at her as if she were light itself? Did the lover turn around in the market square? Did the wax figure melt, and with it, a heart? No one recorded the endings, only the gestures, the hopes, the desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, a string of herbs, a folded note, a whispered word in candlelight could alter the course of another's heart. And even now, centuries later, it's easy to wonder if you knew the right recipe. Would you try it? Would you crush the rosemary, hide the thread, whisper the name? Sports in the ancient world, the first thing you would notice is the dust. Fine, beige, and clingy, kicked up. With every footstep, settling in the folds of togas and tunics, hanging in the air like memory. It covers the low hills of Olympia, coats the polished stones of the gymnasium floor, nestles in the corners of oil jars left uncorked in the mid-morning sun. To witness sport in the ancient world, at least in its most revered form, you must first make peace with the dust. It is the year 456 BCE, and the Olympic Games have begun again. But the Games are not what you think. Not yet a grand spectacle of stadiums and teams. There are no medals, no cheering crowds, waving colored flags, just a gathering of city-states, a scattering of athletes, and a slow churn of rituals, gossip, sweat, and ceremony. The athletes arrive early, some from Athens, lean and well-schooled in the art of rhetoric as much as sport. Others from Sparta, silent and sinewed, trained for endurance over applause. They travel for days, sometimes weeks, on dusty roads. They sleep under awnings near shrines. Some bring their own trainers. Others come alone, barefoot and hopeful. In Olympia, the games begin not with a race or match, but with oaths. At the temple of Zeus, beneath the gaze of the great gold Dandavary statue that creaks slightly as it shifts in the heat, the athletes swear to compete fairly. They promise to avoid bribery, which happens anyway. They vow to train for 10 months, though many have done far less. A priest sprinkles barley on the ground. A boy sings a hymn. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, bored with it all. Training is not glamorous. The gymnasium is open air, just columns, a roof, and dirt. There is no equipment beyond the simplest. Wooden discs for discus, long jump weights made of stone, crude javelins with tips worn smooth by repeated use. The wrestlers cover themselves in olive oil, then dust, then more oil, creating a slippery, granular armor that both protects the skin and frustrates the opponent. No one keeps time. There is no referee in striped garb. Only a Hellenodikai, a judge chosen from among the Ellens, watching with a passive gaze from a shaded seat. Most of the day is spent waiting. The events themselves, boxing, wrestling, pancration, running, happen in short, intense bursts. But hours stretch between them. Spectators mill around the sanctuary, not seated but wandering. They eat figs and barley cakes, gossip about the Athenian envoy who insulted the Spartan general, argue over whether the boxer from Rhodes is too young to compete. The crowd is mostly men, mostly free, mostly sunburnt. There is no shade except where trees linger from older times. For the runners, the stadium is nothing but a long, flat stretch of compacted earth. No lanes, no starting blocks, just a line in the sand and a trumpet to mark the start. The sprint is the original event, just one length of the stadium, about 200 meters. No turning, no pacing. The runners wear nothing but their names, shouted by the herald if they win. They run barefoot, their feet slapping the dust with a cadence older than meters or seconds. At the finish line, there is no ribbon, just a judge's nod and the slope, the wave of an olive branch. The winner does not leap or scream. He bows slightly and walks away. Boxing is slower than you might expect. There are no gloves, just leather straps wound tightly around the knuckles, sometimes weighted with lead. The matches are fought not in rounds, but in endurance. One man yields, or one man falls. There are no weight classes. A match might pit a boy of 17 against a man of 30. Injuries are common. So are complaints. But the crowd rarely intervenes. They chew dates and wait for the blood to dry. Pancration is the most feared eventer, kind of no-holds-barred combat, something between wrestling and brawling. Everything is permitted except biting and eye-gouging, though even that is loosely enforced. The men who enter the pancration arena are calm, deliberate. They stretch slowly, touch the earth 3 times, mutter something to no one in particular. The match begins without fanfare. There is no bell. Just 2 men stepping toward each other, then colliding like stones. You hear grunts, not cheers. When one man concedes raising a finger, always the right hand, the other helps him to his feet. No trophies are handed out. There are no podiums. Victors receive a crown of wild olive leaves, cut from a sacred tree near the temple of Hera. The ceremony is short. Their names are announced. They walk forward. No speeches are given. But the real prize is what comes after, a hero's welcome back home. Meals paid for by the city, poems sung in their honor, statues carved in their image. Some even claim a touch of divinity, closeness to the gods earned not by piety, but by sweat. The games themselves last 5 days. The first day is mostly rituals. The second and third are for boys and lighter events. The fourth is the most intense, the races, the combat, the finals. By the 5th, everyone is exhausted, sun-drunk, hoarse from the dry wind that stirs the leaves but brings no relief. An ox is sacrificed to Zeus. Its blood is collected, its hide hung on a post. Few remember the names of those who cook the meat, but many remember the meal. It is the only one offered freely to all, and then the athletes leave. Quietly they pack their tunics, their jars of leftover oil, their bruises. Some will compete again in other games in Nemea, Delphi, Izmir, but many will never return. Their names will be etched in stone, perhaps, if they won. If not, they will fade like footprints in dust. It's tempting to romanticize it all, but the truth is simpler. These games were often slow, poorly organized, dusty affairs, watched by men with sandals full of pebbles and a limited sense of time. There were no roaring crowds, no corporate banners, no grand declarations of international unity. Only the ritual repetition of something old and slightly strange. Men running, wrestling, sweating, bleeding, then bowing their heads beneath a tree. But in that repetition lay meaning. Because even then, before modern nations, before medals and sponsorships, people gathered in the heat to watch bodies move, to marvel at strength, to feel awe, not at a spectacle, but at effort, at the simple, steady miracle of someone trying hard to do something difficult. And perhaps that's what sport was. At its quiet beginning, not glory, not fame, not profit. Just effort witnessed, effort remembered. Even now, centuries later, if you close your eyes and listen, you might hear it. The crackle of footsteps in dry earth, the thump of a body hitting ground, the long breath of someone rising again. But then, you might ask yourself, what happened to the losers? Where did they go when the olive crowns were gone and the crowds had wandered off into the sun? If the ancient world remembered its victors with songs and statues, it forgot its losers with silence. For every crowned champion in Olympia, there were dozens who went home bruised, unnoticed, unnamed. Their stories are harder to find, not carved in marble or echoed in lyric verse, but buried in quiet lines between surviving texts, hinted at in faded letters and half-finished inscriptions. And yet, their place in the world of ancient sport was essential. Without the ones who fell, there could be no rising. Let us go then, not to the stadium, but to the palestra, the wrestling yard behind the gymnasium, where the defeated trained and lingered. The palestra was a quiet, dusty place where olive trees leaned over low stone benches and the sound of ropes snapping against skin echoed in the morning air. Young men came here daily to practice their grips, their stances, their patience. Most would never compete at Olympia or win a race before thousands, but they trained anyway, because to be strong was to be seen here. A boy named Lycan grips a stone weight, preparing to jump. His knees are dusted with earth. He slipped twice already. His trainer, a slow-speaking man with a crooked nose and permanent sunburn, says, "Nothing." Lycan tries again. He jumps, barely clearing the line. No applause, just the sound of sandals shifting behind him. The boy frowns, wipes his face, and moves to the back of the line. In the corner, another boy older, broader, the discus. His throws arc clumsily, landing short of the marked stick in the ground. But he keeps throwing. Not for victory, but for the feel of it, for the rhythm, for the idea that effort, repeated enough, might lead to something. The culture of sport in the ancient world was not based on entertainment, not really. It was about virtue. The Greeks had a word for it, aretia, difficult word to translate, but one that means something like excellence, or moral strength, or the full flowering of one's potential. An athlete who trained for years, even without winning, was seen as honorable because he pursued arete. Losing was not disgraceful, not trying was. Still, loss stung. And for those without wealth or noble birth, a single bad match could mean the end of an athletic future. While Olympic victors returned to parades and pensions, losers returned to anonymity. Some went back to farming, their muscles put to use pulling carts instead of oars. Others became trainers, passing on what little glory they had grasped for. A few vanished altogether, no tombstones, no records, just sweat soaked into forgotten soil. In Roman times, the culture of sport shifted. With the rise of the empire came the rise of spectacle. Gladiatorial combat, chariot racing, mock naval battles. These were no longer rituals of personal virtue, but mass performances. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal would call them. The losers in these events did not go home. Often they did not rise again. Let's walk now into a different kind of arenaromes. Circus Maximus. It is larger than any Greek stadium, stretching over 600 meters long, able to hold more than 100,000 spectators. At the center stands the spina, a long, narrow barrier adorned with statues, fountains, and Egyptian obelisks brought across the sea. The sand is red with dust and, sometimes, blood. Here, sport means something else entirely. The charioteers are not noblemen, but professionals, often slaves or freedmen, who train from childhood to race horses around this circuit at terrifying speed. The teams are divided by color reds, blues, greens, white sand. Loyalty to these factions runs deeper than family or faith. A loss by your favored team could trigger riots. A win could make a driver a legend to Flavius, a driver for the green team has never won a major race. He's lean, with a sharp jaw and calloused hands. He sleeps in the stables and eats near the horses. He knows each animal by scent, not name. Today, he is set to race third. He stands near the gate, calm. He does not expect to win, but he will not crash. That, in itself, is its own kind of success. As the race begins, the crowd erupts, not in polite cheer, but in guttural, full-throated roars. They scream names, they chant insults, they bet, they curse. The chariots whirl past in a blur of hooves. An iron, a man from the blue team crashes in the second lap. The crowd cheers. Again, violence is part of the thrill. Flavius finishes fourth. No laurels, no songs, but he is alive. That night, he sits in the stables again, wiping mud from his tunic. One of the stable boys asks if he'll race again. Flavius nods. Of course he will. What else is there? In Rome, athletes were not always admired. Gladiators, though idolized by some, were also considered infamous people of low moral status, banned from public office or the army. Charioteers, even popular ones, rarely earned respect. They were seen as tools of distraction, not paragons of virtue, and yet the masses adored them. Graffiti in Pompeii proclaims, "I love Crescens, the net fighter," in messy charcoal script. Another simply reads, "Victory to the Reds," scratched on a wall beside a bakery. Even children mimicked the games, racing toy chariots in dirt alleys, wrestling in fields. The culture of competition was everywhere, and losing, though not praised, was part of the rhythm. In the East, under the Byzantine Empire, sport was both continuation and contradiction. The old Roman chariot factions remained, but now they carried political weight. The blues and greens were not just sports teams, they were political factions, capable of toppling emperors. The Nika riots of 532 CE, sparked by chariot rivalry, led to the deaths of over 30,000 people in Constantinople. And yet, even here, amid the shifting balance of sport and state, there were still losers who went unnoticed, stable boys who died of fever, trainers dismissed after bad seasons, drivers who fell in silence, their names never carved, their efforts never sung. So what did it mean to lose in the ancient world? It meant obscurity. It meant returning home to neighbors who asked careful questions. It meant knowing your effort had been seen by strangers and forgotten by morning. But it did not mean shame, not always. In cultures that prized perseverance and discipline, to have tried and failed was, in itself, a mark of courage. In Athens, one funerary inscription reads simply, "Here lies Philon, who raced but did not win. His legs were strong, his will stronger." It's not a quote that makes history books, but it is deeply human, and it lingers. Even now, when we think of ancient sport, we picture champions, the shining bronze statue, the name carved in stone. But perhaps it's the others, the dusty, unremarked, earnest ones who give sport its soul. Not those who stood atop the pedestal, but those who stood beside it, breathing hard, wiping dust from their brow, and quietly stepping back to train again. As the centuries passed, sport in the ancient world didn't vanish, evolved, and in some places, quietly persisted in the background of empires. But as the classical ideals faded, replaced by the turbulence of invasions, religious reformations, and shifting borders, the way people played, run, wrestled, raced became something more local, less celebrated, and often less recorded. Still, the traditions lingered, not because emperors willed it, but because humans, wherever they were, still needed to run, to throw, to try. In the late Roman Empire, long after the Olympic Games had faded into ritualized memory, fragments of ancient sport lived on in towns and villages, especially in rural areas where temples were replaced by churches and festivals became a blend of Christian and pagan custom. Boys still competed in foot races during spring festivals. Wrestling remained popular in military camps. Farmers in Gallic provinces played crude ball games between rows of ripening wheat. It was not glorious, but it was sport. Quiet, unrecorded, but real. Among the elite, physical exercise slowly gave way to rhetoric. In late antiquity, the model citizen was no longer the bronzed athlete crowned in olive oil, but the educated, well-spoken man. To be physically strong was admirable, but not noble. And so, in schools, boys read Homer's epics more than they ran. Races, athleticism became a background trait, desirable, but not defining. The Olympics themselves sputtered along for a while, but by the 4th century CE, under Emperor Theodosius I, pagan festivals, including the games, were officially banned. The final blow came quietly, and the silence after was profound. The ancient stadiums fell into disuse. Earth and time covered them. The olive trees grew back, yet in Byzantine cities, echoes remained. Wrestling matches were held in courtyards. Children played episkiros, an early form of football, in narrow alleys between high walls. Sport shrank in scale, became more domestic, but it never truly disappeared. What had been sacred competition in the time of Pindar and Plato became pastime. No longer bound to gods or temples, athletic effort belonged to the people. The stadium was now the street. The opponent might be a cousin or a neighbor. The prize, maybe bragging rights, maybe nothing at all. In northern Africa, Berber tribes engaged in stick-fighting competitions as rites of passage. In Syria, foot races were run at Easter festivals, blending Roman athletic tradition with new Christian meaning. In Egypt, Coptic monks, despite their asceticism, sometimes held friendly wrestling bouts during community gatherings, less sport, more social bonding. In Gaul, rough team games were played in fields, resembling a hybrid of rugby and chaos. No rules were written down, but everyone knew when a line had been crossed, usually when someone limped home. What was once the realm of gods and heroes had become a tool for survival, connection, release. Consider the Roman soldiers stationed along Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, cold, isolated, far from home. Among their limited entertainments were games of strength and balance, throwing stones, foot races, arm wrestling in drafty barracks. There were even primitive board games scratched into the stone floors, some strategic, some just for passing. The time, and there too, you see the shift. Ancient sport was no longer about becoming a living statue. It was about staying sane. Even in decline, athletic play remained one of the most human responses to hardship, a way to carve joy into long stretches of routine, a way to keep the body engaged while the mind waited, a way, perhaps, to remind yourself you were still alive in the fading light of a Roman town square. Sometime around the 5th century, a father tosses a ball to his son. The ball is stuffed leather, misshapen, patched with care. The boy drops it, laughs, and picks it up again. No records will preserve this moment, but it happened all the same. Thousands like it. That, too, was sport in the ancient world. Not just stadiums and speeches, but afternoons and accidents. Not only the named champions, but the everyday strivers. By the medieval period, when European scholars began to recover fragments of classical knowledge, what they rediscovered of sport was mostly in texticational descriptions in poems, moral reflections from philosophers, diagrams of javelin technique etched into margins of forgotten manuscripts. The lived culture of competition had changed entirely, and yet the idea remained that effort, discipline, and movement mattered, even in monastic settings, where the body was often viewed as a vessel of temptation. Physical play was not wholly forbidden. Some monasteries allowed games during feast days. Others permitted light wrestling among novices as a form of exercise. The rules were simple, the boundaries clearer than in public life. You played because it reminded you of rhythm, of breath, of limits, and that, in its own way, was sacred. In this final breath of our journey through ancient sport, it's tempting to mourn the loss of spectacle, to think of the ruined stadium at Olympia, the cracked columns of the Palestra, the silence where once thousands gathered to cheer. But perhaps there's something more powerful in what remained, because sport in the ancient world was never just about victory. It was about process, training before dawn, slipping in the dust, trying again, sweating in silence, losing without shame. That ancient rhythm of movement, effort, stillness outlasted empire, and maybe, even now, as children race across courtyards, or strangers meet in weekend soccer games on patchy grass fields, something of that ancient effort lingers. You don't need an olive crown to feel it, just the breath in your chest, the stretch of a stride, the quiet satisfaction of having tried. The catacombs of Paris begins above ground. It always does. The streets of Paris in the 18th century hum with the business of the living markets shouting at dawn, carriage wheels, knocking against cobblestone, chimney smoke curling above rows of slate rooftops. But below the surface, beneath the chatter and clamor, something deeper breathes, slowly, silently. It does not need light, or air, or acknowledgement. The catacombs wait. The Parisians above do not speak much of what lies underneath. At least, not often, not in the morning hours, with bread to buy and news to trade. But they know, they walk over it daily. The weight of life pressing gently down on the bones of the dead. By the mid-1700s, Paris had a problem, a spiritual one, though the clergy tried to frame it that way. It was logistical. The cemeteries were full, crammed, overrun, bloated, with centuries of unmarked burials and hastily dug mass graves. Most notorious was the Cimetière des Innocents, near Les Halles. For centuries, it had served as the city's primary resting place. By the 18th century, it had become something else entirely, a hazard. Graves burst, walls buckled. The scent of death clung to nearby homes and shops. There were reports of tainted wine, of sudden illness, of meat spoiling in butcher stalls overnight. Science had no name for it yet, but the people knew something was wrong with the earth. The solution came from below. Beneath the streets of Paris sprawled a network of ancient limestone quarries, many of them abandoned, hollowed out over centuries. To feed the city's hunger for stone, they stretched for miles, mapped dark, forgotten. They were not built with purpose. They simply happened as miners dug and dug, shaping voids where once there had been rock. Few knew how far they ran. Few cared. They were just part of the underground, until someone had the idea, what if we moved the dead there? It was not a popular suggestion, but it was a necessary one. Beginning in 1785, under the reign of Louis XVI, a quiet operation began. At night, under cover of darkness and ritual, carts rolled through the streets, wooden wagons draped in black cloth, accompanied by priests holding lanterns and murmuring prayers. Inside the wagons, bones, skulls, femurs, tibias, ribs, stacked, bundled, bagged, carried from cemetery to quarry in solemn processions that few watched, and even fewer understood. The operation was slow, careful. No signs were posted. No names were preserved. The idea was not to glorify death, but to organize it. Paris needed room to breathe. The dead were in the way. Down into the tunnels they went, the workers tasked with arranging the bones were not scholars. They were quarrymen, often the same men who had mined the stone decades earlier. They knew the tunnels, the slopes, the soft spots. They moved by lamplight and instinct, stacking bones with a strange kind of order, skulls in rows, femurs in pillars, ribs packed like firewood. They did not speak while they worked, or, if they did, no one recorded it. At first the bones were simply deposited, dumped in mounds, left in piles. But in time, a sense of aesthetics emerged. Patterns were made. Walls were built, carefully constructed, stacks of femurs interspersed with neat rows of skulls. Crosses formed from bones, hearts, arches, columns. The catacombs became something more than storage. They became architecture, art in a grim, wordless way. There was no blueprint, just repetition. A rhythm of bone on stone, echoing faintly in the darkness. Visitors were rare in the early years. The tunnels were treacherous and mapped, unstable, sometimes flooding without warning. Some sections caved in, others twisted into dead ends. But the dead remained, undisturbed. Over time, more bones came. More cemeteries were emptied. Less innocence was only the beginning. By the early 1800s, the remains of over 6 million Parisians had been relocated to the catacombs. 6 million stories, 6 million silences. Above ground, Paris changed. The revolution came, then the empire, then more revolutions. The cemeteries grew quieter, cleaner, laws changed, but the bones below stayed the same. There is a strange stillness in the catacombs, thicker than darkness, quieter than silence. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Memory, perhaps. Or wait, the air is cool. Always. The temperature never shifts. About 14 degrees Celsius, give or take. The walls drip in places, moisture seeping through the limestone. It smells of stone, of age, of something faintly sweet and mineral. The passages stretch for miles. Only a portion is open to the public today, but the rest exists. Beneath schools, bakeries, government buildings, miles of tunnels, some mapped, many not, and within those tunnels the bones sit, not buried, not hidden, simply present. Skulls stare from niches, femurs form supporting walls. Some of the older bones crumble slightly when touched, though touching is now forbidden. Visitors once carved their names into the skulls, but this too has been banned. The catacombs are not a canvas, they are a consequence. But what were the lives of those bones? Who were they, the 6 million? The merchants, the mothers, the thieves, the monks, the dancers, the children, all lost to time, stripped of names and memories, equalized in arrangement. A nobleman's skull rests beside that of a mason's apprentice. A washerwoman's femur leans against that of a soldier. Death made no hierarchy here, only symmetry, and yet, you wonder, was someone's favorite song once hummed beneath that skull? Did someone else die laughing? Did another hold a secret they never shared? 6 million untold stories reduced to patterns. Quiet geometry, the catacombs are not. Haunted not in the way people imagine. There are no whispers, no ghosts, only echoes, and the occasional drip of water from a place too dark to see. But still, there is a question. Not about death, that part is certain, but about presence. What does it mean to arrange the dead? To make them part of the infrastructure? To walk among their carefully stacked remains on your way to work, or to school, or to a bakery? It is not a monument. It is not a grave. It is a compromise. And in that compromise lies the deepest, quietest mystery of all. Are the catacombs a sign of reverence, or of forgetfulness, or somehow of both? The catacombs did not remain untouched. As the 19th century turned, curiosity grew, not among the poor who had enough of death in daily life, but among the curious, the intellectual, the fashionable. The catacombs became something strange, a destination, a place to see. They were still unofficial, still quiet, but word spread. In 1809, under the direction of Louis-Étienne Héricart, Dethurier geologist and inspector general of the quarries, the catacombs were transformed into something more organized. Not just a storage site, but a museum of death. He reinforced the walls, added plaques with poetic inscriptions, organized the bones with greater symmetry. It became a kind of moral landscape, a place where the living could reflect on the futility of ambition, vanity, class, all the things death made irrelevant. Guided tours began for the elite. They brought lanterns and notebooks. Some came for education, others for thrill. They walked slowly through the halls, fingers grazing bone walls, pausing at the Latin mottos etched into limestone. Stop, this is the empire of death. The message was clear. Here we are all equal. Here we are all gone. But the visitors kept coming. Over time, the catacombs became a strange theatre of the macabre. In the 1860s, Charles Baudelaire reportedly visited, calling it a deeper silence than the grave. By the 1890s, writers, poets, and students held clandestine readings down in the tunnels, candles flickering, words bouncing off stone. The dead were silent, but the living filled the void. Even Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, visited. He brought diplomats. He wanted to impress them with the city's depth, its literal depth. The idea of a city that remembered its dead not with statues or plaques, but with infrastructure, fascinated him. It seemed both modern and ancient, efficient and eerie. Not all visits were official. Over time, adventurers and wanderers, as cataphiles began to map the unmapped, they entered through maintenance shafts, sewer grates, abandoned staircases. They explored by candle and memory. They found chambers no one had used in centuries. Graffiti from 1810, forgotten bones, wells that echoed for minutes. Some left nothing. Others left poems scrawled in chalk or carvings etched gently into stone, not to deface, but to leave something of themselves behind. Some claimed to see strange things, a wall that seemed to shift when unobserved, a tunnel that never ended, a sudden warmth in an otherwise cold place. Rational minds dismissed these as tricks of light, of air, of nerves. But even the most grounded explorer moved a little faster after too long in the dark, and the bones watched. Always, there were rumors, of course, of the man who entered alone and was never seen again, of voices heard where no one stood, of footsteps, too many for one set of legs. Nothing was proven, but stories clung to the catacombs like moisture. During the Second World War, the tunnels were used again not for bones, but for survival. The French resistance carved out safe havens in the dark, establishing networks where maps failed. They held meetings under the skull-lined vaults, whispered strategies beneath FEMA arches. Germans, too, explored the tunnels, some to hunt rebels, others for their own purposes. In 1944, a German bunker was built into the catacombs, deep under the 14th arrondissement. Its remains still exist. A rusted desk, collapsed chairs, silence. The bones watched that. Time passed. Paris changed again. The cemeteries above grew orderly, beautiful, serene. Père Lachaise Montparnasse, Montmartre, places of stone angels and tidy graves. The city had learned to curate death, but the catacombs remained stubbornly unrefined. Today, only about 1.7 kilometers of the catacombs are open to visitors. The tour takes under an hour. A few 100,000 people pass through each year, moving slowly beneath the surface. Beneath the living city, through carefully lit halls. They pause at the displays. They read the plaques. They pose, sometimes. A skull here, a row of femurs there. The lighting is dim, not dramatic. Flash photography is discouraged. Silence is encouraged. But beyond the official path, the catacombs stretch for over 200 kilometers. That's the part most forget. The city below the city is vast. Entire districts of Paris rest on bone-laced tunnels. Some are mapped, most are not. Some are blocked by debris, flooded, collapsed. Others remain hidden behind locked gates or disguised doors in metro stations. A few are rumored to be so secret that not even the city knows they exist. Within those unofficial catacombs are rooms that defy expectation. The Bar of Bones, a clandestine gathering spot with chairs made of rubble. The Catacombs Cinema, once fitted with a projector and makeshift seating. The chapel, where cataphiles once left candles and painted icons marking or honoring religion. No one's quite sure. But not all of the underground is romantic or poetic. Some tunnels collapse without warning. Air can turn stale. Water can rise. Cell signal vanishes quickly. A wrong turn becomes hours of disorientation. There have been rescues. And, rarely, tragedies. Yet still, people return. Quietly, reverently, rebelliously. Perhaps it's because, in a world that constantly forgets, the catacombs remember everything. Every stone laid. Every bone stacked. Every silence kept. There are no names down there. Not anymore, but there is presence. A deep, steady presence that outlasts war, plague, revolution, and curiosity. You cannot feel indifferent in the catacombs. Even the most casual tourist, halfway through the tour, starts to walk a little slower. Their voice drops a little lower, because it becomes clear, somewhere between the third and fourth alcove, that you are not merely walking through a tunnel. You are walking through memory, through the infrastructure of mortality. The catacombs do not ask you to fear death. They simply remind you that death does not leave. It stays patiently, carefully, quietly. And then there's the thought harder. To shake the longer you're underground. What if the dead are watching, not haunting, not judging, just witnessing? Not because they're waiting for something, but because they already saw everything, and they want to remember. 2. There is a particular stillness that follows you when you leave the catacombs, a heaviness that sits quietly on your shoulders, as though something unseen had been watching and now has let go. You step back into the living city, into light, into sound, into motion, and everything feels slightly too loud, too fast. The cars honk, the pigeons flap, the market sellers shout over baskets of lemons and cheese. But beneath it all, you know, the silence is still there. Just deeper, in the modern city, the catacombs are both memory and mirror. They are not just relics of the past, but a commentary on the present. They tell us that infrastructure can be intimate, that a city can grow on top of itself, that the dead can become the foundation of the living. Literally. Paris is unique in this way. Many cities have cemeteries. Some even have ossuaries, small tidy chapels where bones are arranged decoratively. But only Paris has a fully integrated network of the dead. A place not apart from daily life, but beneath it, supporting it, without fanfare, without legend. Just bones, walls, patience. There is no great mystery to the catacombs, not in the way popular culture imagines. No cursed skulls, no secret rituals, no haunted labyrinths with flickering candlelight. The truth is more mundane and more powerful. The catacombs were born of necessity, not superstition. They are not a monument to death, but a solution to a problem. Paris was growing. The ground was full. Something had to be done. And what was done, in the end, was practical, efficient, morally complex. Instead of graves, the dead were reorganized. Instead of prayers, they were stacked. Instead of epitaphs, they were remembered in mass. In this way, the catacombs challenge everything we think about death and dignity. They ask, is a name necessary for remembrance? Does anonymity erase meaning? Can the shape of a skull speak louder than a written eulogy? There is no one answer, but the catacombs do not offer answers. They offer presence. Consider this: most of the 6 million bones in the catacombs were moved without record. Entire cemeteries were emptied at night. Bodies long decayed, identities lost. No one asked permission. No family stood vigil. The city simply decided to rehouse its history underground. It's easy to find this disturbing, and yet perhaps it is also a kind of democracy. In a city stratified by wealth, by rank, by dress and accent and education, the catacombs made everyone equal: merchant, noble, pauper, thief. They all now exist in the same silence, the same space, the same architectural logic of death. And maybe that's the strange lesson the catacombs leave behind. That memory does not need to be loud. That death is not the opposite of life, but its silent companion. That a city can carry its past not in books or museums, but in its very bones. Of course, not everyone sees the catacombs this way. Some visit only for the novelty, for the thrill of standing among skulls, for the Instagram photograph, for the whisper of morbidity. And that's understandable. The catacombs are striking. They feel transgressive, but they are not grotesque. They are ordered, calm, almost serene, and in that serenity is their power. Others come seeking connection: historians, philosophers, the devout, the grieving. They walk slowly, they touch nothing, they whisper. They linger a little longer in the darker corners, not because they expect revelation, but because they feel something close to eat a presence, a weight, a truth, too quiet for words. And then there are those who come back again and again. The cataphiles, the explorers, the modern-day urban pilgrims. They do not always speak about what they see, but they know. There are places down there no one has entered in centuries. Bones so old they crumble at a breath. Water pooled in echoing silence. Rooms where you can hear your own heartbeat louder than your thoughts. It is not about death. It is about scale, about history, about understanding that we are small, and that smallness can be beautiful. In one chamber, barely marked on any map, there is a single inscription carved into the stone. Not Latin, not religious, just a line traced by a steady hand. Sometime in the early 1800s, Nous n'y faisons que passer. We are only passing through. And perhaps that is the true story of the catacombs. Not a story of horror, or of grandeur, or of spectacle, but of passing through, of movement, from body to bone, from grave to tunnel, from life to silence. The catacombs do not frighten. They do not even mourn. They witness, and in that witnessing, they offer something rare. In history, perspective without judgment, memory without preference, a place where you are not asked to believe, or to understand, but simply to be, just like the 6 million who came before you. So when you emerge from the catacombs, blinking into daylight, breathing the bright air of the living, you carry something different with you. Not fear, not sorrow, but the quiet understanding that we live, quite literally, on the past, and that the past, stacked, patient, silent, is always closer than we think. Forgotten kitchens, what people ate in times of war. In every war, while generals argue and soldiers march, someone still has to make dinner. It is an overlooked truth of history, that while battles raged across fields and cities burned, in back rooms, trenches, and broken homes, people were peeling roots, boiling grains, stretching scraps into meals. The drama of war is always loud drums, speeches, gunfire, but the survival of war that is quiet, slow, often bitter, and often shaped by what people could find to eat. Let us begin not with a battlefield, but with a pot of thin soup, bubbling quietly over a weak fire in a crumbling home. The year is 1812. Napoleon's Grand Army is retreating from Moscow. The winter is harsher than expected, and the supply wagons have long been left behind. Soldiers, cold, starving, many without boots, stumble through snow-covered fields in search of anything edible. Grass, bark, a frozen beet left in a root cellar. Horse meat, if the horse dies. Shoe leather, soaked and boiled, becomes desperate. Stew, officially, each French soldier was supposed to receive a ration of bread, meat, and wine. In reality, during the Russian campaign, they ate whatever they could scavenge. A handful of flour mixed with melted snow, rats, sometimes candles. One diary recounts soldiers melting down beeswax and swallowing it for fat. It wasn't nourishing, but it was something further behind the lines. Civilians were no better off. Russian peasants burned their own villages to deny food and shelter to the invaders. Granaries were emptied, wells fouled. It was a kind of culinary scorched earth policy. You cannot win with arms. You can starve the enemy into defeat. But starvation has no favorites. Children scavenged in woods for nuts and mushrooms. Women boiled tree bark in water, trying to extract anything remotely edible. One widow in Smolensk was found grinding animal bones into powder and mixing it with water into flat cakes. They were impossible to chew, but she called them bread. This was not unique to Napoleon's invasion. In war after war, across centuries and continents, people ate what they never would have considered in times of peace. Hunger rewrote recipes. Necessity invented new cuisines. And from the bones of scarcity, people found ways to stay alive. Let's move backward now, to the Middle Ages, to a siege. In 1098, during the First Crusade, the Christian army besieged the city of Antioch for 8 grueling months. Supplies ran low, then out. The army began to eat boiled grass, leather straps, even the flesh of animals, usually reserved for riding, donkeys, dogs, horses. The chroniclers, of course, tried to maintain dignity. They spoke of extreme hardship, but between the lines, the truth seeped through. Starvation. One soldier wrote of mixing barley flour with blood his own, or that of a wounded mule, it's unclear, and baking it into hard biscuits. They had no salt. They tasted like iron. They were better than nothing. Inside the city walls, the defenders fared no better. Their storerooms emptied slowly, then quickly. Salted fish, smoked lamb, pickled onions vanished. Soon they too turned to grass, then rats, then the dead. We do not linger on this easily, but the history of wartime food is not meant to be easy. It is meant to be endured. Not all war meals were grim. In some cases, soldiers got creative. During the American Civil War, Union troops sometimes fried hardtack, a hard biscuit made from flour and water in bacon grease to soften it. They called the result skilly galley. Confederate soldiers, lacking coffee, boiled roasted corn kernels as a substitute. It tasted like burnt dirt, but it was warm and it was familiar. And in war, sometimes that's enough. In World War I, the trench kitchens of the Western Front developed their own bleak cuisine. British soldiers were issued bully beef, canned corned beef, hard biscuits, and tea. With luck, there were potatoes. With more luck, onions. One popular dish involved mixing the beef with mashed potatoes and frying it in a pan over a portable stove. It was called McConaughey stew, after the company that canned it. Most soldiers simply called it horrible. Still, meals mattered, not just for survival, but for morale. The ability to sit even briefly and eat something warm gave a kind of dignity back to men knee-deep in mud. It reminded them they were still human. In the German trenches, thin soups of barley or lentils were common. They were stretched with whatever vegetables could be found. Carrots, if lucky. Turnips, often. A single slice of rye bread was a luxury. Soldiers wrote home asking for sausage, butter, coffee, anything. Some got care packages. Most didn't. In Paris, under siege during the Franco-Prussian War, 1872-71, things became stranger still. The food shortages were severe. People ate zoo animals literally. Records show that the elephant castor from the Jardin des Plantes was butchered and served as steak to wealthy Parisians. Menus from restaurants of the time proudly list antelope terrine, roast camel, and stuffed peacock. It was both survival and performance, an attempt to pretend that civilization could survive starvation. But most Parisians didn't eat exotic animals. They ate rats. Butcher shops in working-class neighborhoods sold them by the dozen, sometimes skewered like kebabs. The rich may have had elephant. The poor had rodents, cooked in garlic and wine, if either could be found. In many wars, children became scavengers, small enough to slip through barricades, quiet enough to move unseen. In Warsaw during World War II, Jewish children smuggled potatoes and bread into the ghetto at great personal risk. Some were caught, some survived. All knew that food was the line between life and death. Sometimes that line blurred in the Leningrad siege, 1941-44. Civilians endured nearly 900 days of starvation. Daily bread rations fell to 125 grams. The bread was made from flour mixed with sawdust. People boiled leather book bindings, wallpaper paste, anything with starch. Entire recipes emerged from that starvation, recipes that survive today in museum archives, preserved as a testament to human endurance. There was bread made from potato peels and malt, soup made from boiled buttons and birch bark. It was not food, but it was survival. And even in these conditions, people tried to preserve ritual. Birthdays were observed with cake made from dried turnip slices, stacked and salted. Weddings included a single egg, split among 5. It wasn't about nourishment anymore. It was about identity. What people eat in war is more than sustenance. It is defiance. It is culture refusing to disappear. It is history written in hunger. But what happens when even hunger cannot find food? In ancient Rome, during a particularly brutal siege of Jerusalem, 70 CE, the historian Josephus records that some mothers ate their own children. Whether literal or exaggerated, the record stands, and the horror of it echoes through centuries. That war pushes people past even the limits of hunger, past survival, into desperation so deep that it unnames the self. But this is not the whole story, because, just as often, war food is about invention. During World War II, in Britain, rationing led to creative solutions. Housewives made carrot jam, beetroot sandwiches, potato flour pancakes. The Ministry of Food issued pamphlets encouraging citizens to grow their own vegetables. Victory gardens sprang up in parks, schools, rooftops. Recipes changed to match what could be grown or bartered. Austerity created innovation, in China, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, rural communities developed recipes using tree leaves, wild herbs, and fermented roots. They used rice hulls, the part normally discarded, to create dense, fibrous dumplings. They were chewy. They were bitter. They kept people alive. Food doesn't vanish during war. It transforms. And in that transformation lies a kind of quiet, practical bravery. Not the kind carved in marble or sung in anthems, but the kind that boils a bitter root, stirs it with care, and feeds a child. It is that kind of bravery that goes unnoticed in most history books. But it is the kind that keeps history going. The recipes of war rarely make it into cookbooks. They are rarely passed down proudly or served at holidays. They are not heritage meals. They are survival. And yet, buried deep in archives and memory, these improvised wartime foods tell stories that formal histories miss. They show us how people endured, not just with courage, but with creativity, with pots and pans instead of swords, with ingenuity instead of abundance. Let's begin this leg of our journey in World War II, in Britain. The rationing system there became one of the most strictly organized in modern history. Starting in 1940, citizens received ration books that covered items like meat, sugar, butter, and tea. The amounts were meager, about 4 ounces of bacon per person per week, 2 ounces of cheese, 1 egg, and yet families made do. In a small town in Kent, a mother fed 6 children on what would barely make 2 meals today. She mashed boiled carrots with oats to form patties. She soaked stale bread in milk to stretch meat scraps. When sugar ran low, she made syrup out of beets. And still, there were birthdays. She made cakes out of grated potatoes and dried apples, mixed with what little flour she could barter. The British Ministry of Food published cheerful propaganda, dig for victory. Food is a weapon of war, and keep calm and carry. On pamphlets, encourage citizens to plant gardens, raise rabbits, and waste nothing. Even potato peelings had a purpose. They could be fried, dried, or boiled into soup stock. Lord Woolton pie became famous not because it was delicious, but because it was filling and didn't require meat. Named after the Minister of Food, the dish was a mix of turnips, carrots, onions, and potatoes, thickened with oats or flour, and topped with a crust made from mashed potatoes or breadcrumbs. It was humble, it was dull. It helped people get through the Blitz, and not everything was grim. Communities shared food, neighbors traded recipes. Housewives formed cooperatives to cook in bulk. And sometimes, a friend had an egg when you didn't. Sometimes, kindness made dinner possible in occupied France. The situation was more dire. German forces requisitioned food for their own use, leaving little for the local population. By 1942, butter was nearly impossible to find. Coffee was replaced by roasted chicory root. People bartered with their neighbors. Black markets thrived, but in the countryside, people remembered how to forage. Elderly women who'd grown up before the Great War taught their daughters how to make soups from nettles and mushrooms gathered at dawn became stew. Wild herbs added flavor to otherwise flavorless bread. Dandelion leaves were cooked into greens. Some made makeshift flour by grinding acorns. Old cookbooks were dug up. Medieval recipes because they were fashionable, but because they required ingredients nobody else wanted. In Warsaw, Jewish families trapped in the ghetto created meals from next to nothing. In diaries recovered after the war, we find references to potato sugar, made by boiling potatoes until the liquid thickened into a sticky glaze. It tasted faintly sweet. It was spread on bread. There was bread, soup was constant, onion, peel broth, beet water, cabbage boiled for hours until it lost all structure. These meals were not satisfying, but they were made with intention, made with a kind of exhausted love, and in every case, food became more than sustenance. It became identity. You see this, especially in prisoner of war camps. In World War II, Allied Pows, held in German camps, formed cooking clubs. Men would describe, in vivid detail, their favorite meals from back home. They'd write recipes in tiny notebooks, fantasizing about roast beef, gravy, Yorkshire pudding. They drew illustrations of holiday meals they'd never eat again. They called this food dreaming. And for many, it kept them sane. A captured Australian airman recalled how a fellow prisoner cooked dinner in their barracks. He drew a table in the dust, placed imaginary plates, and narrated each course. Tonight, gentlemen, we begin with oysters, then roast duck, then trifle, if you don't mind. It was absurd. It was necessary. Hunger needed imagination. In Japan, during the final years of the war, food shortages pushed civilians into radical substitutions. Rice, a cultural staple, was stretched with barley, millet, and even chestnut flour. People ground sweet potato vines into paste. Seaweed became the main source of salt. Bento boxes were simplified beyond recognition. Yet still, mothers packed them. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a young girl remembered her mother giving her a cake made from mashed azuki beans and soy sauce, wrapped in newspaper. It was gray. It fell apart in her hands. But her mother smiled when she gave it to her. That smile meant more than the taste. Back in Europe, in the Netherlands, the winter of 1944-45 became known as the Hunger Winter. Nazi blockades cut off food to Dutch cities. People survived on tulip bulbs and sugar beets. Some tried to roast bulbs like potatoes. Others sliced them thin, boiled them, and spread them like jam. One woman wrote in her diary, "The house smells of earth and hope." When the war ended, the first arrival of bread from relief agencies brought people to tears. A single slice of white bread was treated like gold, not because of its taste, but because of what it symbolized. Peace. In the Vietnam War, food was both a tactic and a trap. American forces dropped canned rations, some of which were used by Viet Cong fighters, others which were turned into lures. Booby traps were sometimes baited with meat. In turn, Vietnamese fighters relied on jungle food, cassava, bananas, wild greens. They fermented fish and rice in underground tunnels. They grew crops under camouflage nets to avoid detection from the air. Their food was basic but adaptable. And in that adaptability lay resilience. But sometimes, food became protest. In Ireland, during the Troubles, imprisoned activists went on hunger strikes. They weaponized the absence of food, and in doing so, reminded the world that even not eating can be political, that meals, or their refusal, can carry the weight of centuries across history. War food has left few lasting legacies on our plates, but it left deep marks on memory. Even today, in families that lived through conflict, you find habits that trace back to those years. Grandmothers who save every scrap of bread. Fathers who insist nothing must ever be thrown away. Recipes that seem strange unless you know the story, like cabbage pie, sugarless pudding, eggless cake, all born from war, all kept alive by memory. In these forgotten kitchens, quiet, improvised, desperate, we see the shape of endurance. The small decisions that helped people keep going, to eat and feed and survive without ever knowing if peace would come. And sometimes, even in war, people made room for joy. In 1945, in Berlin, a woman baked a cake from barley flour, powdered milk, and stale jam to celebrate the end of fighting. She cut it into tiny slices and handed them to strangers on the street. They had no idea who she was. In Stalingrad, a boy shared his last biscuit with a wounded soldier. That soldier lived. Years later, he found the boy's family and thanked them. These aren't myths, they're footnotes. But footnotes have weight, because even in the worst of times, someone still had to make dinner, and that act, simple, quiet, unglamorous, is one of the deepest kinds of resistance history offers. When we imagine history, we often picture the loudest parts: wars declared, cities sacked, flags raised in triumph or torn in surrender. But history also happened in kitchens, in cold cellars and cramped shelters, around fires made of scavenged wood, with pots balanced precariously on broken bricks. History happened when someone decided to make soup out of scraps and to share it. Because even in war, even in the exhaustion of siege, in the smoke of bombings, in the shadows of occupation, people still ate, or tried to. And that trying is its own kind of legacy. Food in wartime was not about flavor. It was about survival and memory and stubbornness. Meals became rituals of resistance, ways to assert control when everything else was being taken away. And long after the wars ended, those rituals didn't vanish. In post-war Europe, you could still see the imprint of conflict on people's diets. In rural Italy, families used stale bread to thicken every soup, just as they had done during fascist grain shortages. In Germany, recipes avoided eggs or butter for decades, not because they weren't available, but because mothers had learned not to rely on them. The habit of preserving every leftover became almost sacred. In some families, throwing away a crust of bread was considered shameful, even superstitious bad luck. In Hungary, older women continued to make flourless dumplings, just as they had during wartime rationing. Not because they had to, but because they remembered. In Japan, post-war school lunches became part of national healing. Every child received a modest, nutritious meal, usually rice, miso soup, and a protein. For a generation that had known hunger, this daily ritual was a reminder that peace was something you could taste, that food could rebuild a nation. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of wartime kitchens is the idea that food connects us, not just to comfort, but to identity. When immigrants fled conflicts, Vietnam, Syria, the Balkans, East Africa, they carried their food memories with them. A type of flatbread, a spice blend, a way of wrapping meat in leaves. These were not just recipes, they were pieces of home. And often, they were all that could be carried in refugee camps. Food is often standardized, calories calculated, nutrition controlled. But people still find ways to make it their own. They trade, they swap, they flavor with memory. A woman from Aleppo, living in a camp in Greece, boiled lentils with garlic and lemon, and called it by its old name, mujadara. She said it didn't taste the same without cumin, but her daughter smiled when she smelled it cooking. That was enough in Bosnia. During the siege of Sarajevo, a woman named Alma baked bread every morning using flour from humanitarian aid. She would walk through sniper fire to share it with elderly neighbors. She said it gave her a reason to get up each day. The bread, she said, made me feel like myself. In modern Ukraine, citizens under attack in 2022 baked loaves of Palianitsia, traditional sourdough known not just for its taste, but as a kind of linguistic test. Russian soldiers could not pronounce it properly. It became both sustenance and signal. This is the quiet power of food in conflict. Not just that it fills the stomach, but that it says, I am still here. This is still who I am. Some foods, born in hardship, remain with us in unexpected ways. During the Great Depression in the US, a cake made without eggs, milk, or butter became popular. It was called wacky cake. Moist chocolatey, made from vinegar and baking soda. It was cheap, easy, delicious. Today, it's served at birthday parties across America, often without people knowing where it came from. In Britain, children still eat carrot cookies first invented during World War II to replace sugar-heavy biscuits. In Eastern Europe, beet soup borscht has many variations, but some of its leanest, most pared-down forms come from wartime economies, when roots and water were all that was available. And then there's hardtack, once a symbol of military drudgery, now sold in heritage tins and eaten at reenactments. Even when meals weren't remembered for flavor, they were remembered for meaning, because food is never just about nutrients. It's about ritual, continuity, and hope. One Holocaust survivor, when interviewed late in life, was asked what she remembered most about the camps. She didn't mention the violence. She said, I remember the day someone gave me a whole onion. I hadn't seen one in a year. I smelled it for 10 minutes before I ate it. That onion, for her, was more than food. It was color, memory, life. These are the forgotten kitchens of history. The ones without cookbooks. The ones where measurements were approximate and ingredients were often missing. Where a single spoonful of oil was cause for celebration. Where meals were whispered, not shouted, and yet they mattered, because in every war, the battle for survival wasn't only fought with weapons, it was fought with pots and pans, with scraps and roots, with hunger and with the refusal to give into it completely. That is a kind of bravery, to dot, and perhaps the most telling measure of a war is not just what was lost, but what was cooked and eaten and shared. So when we ask, what did people eat during the war, we are really asking something else. How did they survive? What did they hold on to? What stories were stirred into soup? What identity rose with the steam from a chipped tin pot? History does not often record these things, but you can still taste them, if you listen closely enough, in the quiet kitchens, in the bitter stews, in the humble loaves that helped people outlast the darkness.